Thank you, Richard, and thank you to the Municipal Art Society for having the High Line. As he said, I'm Paul Heckler. I'm the Director of Foundation and Government Support for Friends of the High Line. In a room like this full of such civic-minded New Yorkers, I don't think it's probably necessary to retell the story of the High Line. I will mention very, very briefly that we're the organization that advocated for saving and preserving and transforming the High Line rail structure into a public park. And we worked with the City of New York to do that and with many organizations and individuals, and I'm sure there are some of you in this room who've been involved. I'm going to give you just a quick little overview of context of where we are now as a park, the High Line, and as an organization, Friends of the High Line. Last year, we welcomed 7.6 million people to the High Line, which is a lot. Here's just some comparisons of other destinations within New York City and how many visitors they get. Unlike the majority of those listed on this slide, though, the more visitors for us is more costs in terms of operating the park, and we don't charge admission. We're free of charge all day, every day. So more visitors means more costs for us. But we're still pretty excited about that level of success and that level of visitorship. When we were planning the park, we assumed that around 300,000 people a year would come, so we've obviously done a little better than that. Of our visitorship, around 31% are New York City residents, which is great. In 2015, that was around 2.3 million people. And then we have visitors who come from the rest of the US and from the rest of the world. And one of the things that people ask me a lot is they tell me that the High Line is very crowded and they don't like to go there because there are too many people, which I totally understand. I'm there every day and I understand that it's crowded. What I say to people like that is come early, come before 11 a.m. or come after 4 p.m., much better. You get it to yourself, you can sit down in one of the lounge chairs, you can enjoy the sunset, particularly as the natural light goes down and the lights in the park come up, it's really fantastic. I also want to point out that of our New York City residents, around 44% last year were people of color, which is really important for us. When we first opened the park, it was a much lower percentage were people of color, and it's really important to us as a public park, as a democratic space, as an amenity that's meant for everyone, that we reflect the full diversity of New York City. And so we're working on that, and I'll talk more about the public programs that we're doing that are helping with that number in a few minutes. And I'll also just mention that, I think the story of economic success at the High Line is pretty well known, that there's been a big development boom. But there's also a social value to public space and to public parks. And now that we've built the park, we're really investing in understanding what our social value is, what our social impact is, and what we can do to ensure that the High Line works for everyone. So just as a couple quick notes, West Chelsea has one of the largest concentration of public housing on the west side, south of Columbus Circle. It also has a lot of number of naturally occurring retirement communities and a lot of really wonderful community-based organizations. And we see ourselves as a park as something that, and as a really interesting park that's linear, as something that connects those communities to each other, to the new development, and to the city as a whole. So what do we do for people? How do we serve them? So we're a park. At our heart, at the core of what we do is we care for a really vibrant landscape that is there for people in New York. So we have around 116,000 plantings, and we have a staff of around 12 full-time gardeners who take care of that landscape and make sure that those plants are maintained well. We champion environmentally sensitive methods. We use integrated pest management. We don't use chemical pesticides or fertilizers, and we really make sure that that landscape is well maintained. We also have custodians who take care of the park. We have maintenance technicians, because it's really more of a horizontal skyscraper than a traditional park. We have lighting systems, we have elevators, and because it's 1.5 miles long and because it's 30 feet up, our custodians, this is Andrew here, they have to take the trash and the recycling that accumulates at 34th Street and 12th Avenue and bring it all the way down the High Line through those crowds of people to Gansevoort Street, where we process our trash and recycling. So it can be a real challenge to operate the park. Also a lot of fun, but and so one of the sort of big misconceptions that's out there about the High Line is people think that the city pays for it. And certainly the city is one of the largest funders of the creation of the High Line. They invested, I'll show you later, many millions of dollars in building it. But in terms of operating it, most of that support is raised by Friends of the High Line. We raise around 98% of the funds to to pay for all those gardeners and those custodians and maintenance technicians. And that comes from people like all of you. I'm sure there's some members and supporters in this room, and from thousands of individuals and organizations across the city and across the country. And just about 2% of our annual operations come from the City of New York, and much of that is actually in competitive grants from city agencies like the Department of Cultural Affairs or the National Endowment for the Arts, which is not a city agency, but which is also governmental. And then I mentioned briefly that public programming is really important to us. Since we've opened, we've made this transition from being an organization that's about advocacy and construction to one that's about taking care of a public space. And that change has brought about a lot of different changes for us as an organization. And most importantly, we realize that over the long term, the most important thing we can do is serve the communities that the High Line is a resource for, and serve the community of New York City and the community, the sort of vast group of people who come to the park. And so we do that by offering public programming. We have a number of different target communities, and every year we offer hundreds of public programs that serve tens of thousands of people overall. So for starters, we have school programs. We offer 75-minute field trips up on the High Line. You come, your public school class, 10 to 20 kids, and we split you up into groups of 10 and take you around the park, and you learn about architecture, you learn about city history, you learn about ecology and horticulture, and you learn about art and all of the wonderful things that you can really see in action on the High Line in a way that you can't at many other places. We also do more in-depth partnerships with public schools that are in the neighborhood, after-school programming, in-school learning, things like that. We also have family programming. It's offered every sort of April through October, monthly on Saturdays, 6-hour festivals that you can bring your family to, and everyone can experience the High Line together and can learn together, can have fun together, doing art projects, listening to music, having story time for little ones, things like that. And then we have one of the most sort of community-focused programs that we have is our teen programs. We work with 28 teens every year, and they do one of two tracks. They're mostly youth of color, primarily from low-income backgrounds who live in either the public housing near the park or go to public schools in the neighborhood. And what we offer them is job training and work experience and a competitive wage to work with us. So about half of them work on the High Line. They work alongside our gardeners in caring for the landscapes. They learn about green jobs, they learn about sustainability, and then they go out into the city and they work at other green spaces around the city. And the other group of them, and this is what you can see here in this photograph, we call them the Teen Arts and Culture Council, and they work on cultural programming. So they produce 2 big events for teens every year, every summer, that are held on the High Line, that are, attract around 1,500 kids total from all over the city to come to the High Line and have a great time and learn and celebrate. We also do programming for grown-ups. It's not just the kids and the teens. We have Arriba, which is a monthly series of salsa, live salsa dancing and music on the High Line during the summer. We have Stargazing, which is in association with the Amateur Astronomers Association of New York, which is on Tuesdays in the warmer months, and lots more. You can learn about all of this on our website, thehighline.org, and we'd love to see you at some of our programming. It's a lot of fun. So, and then finally, we have public art. This is a sculpture called Sleepwalker. I've been calling him Carl because he kind of looks like a Carl, right? And he's part of a group show on the High Line right now that it's called Wanderlust, and it's exploring what it means to be on a journey. And he's clearly on some kind of journey. He's a painted cast bronze. And then one other art piece, which I think has taken on a lot of new relevance for me personally and for a lot of us since last week at this time, is this work. It's a mural by the conceptual artist Barbara Kruger. And we installed it in March and we thought it was cool, and then all of a sudden it means something very different. So that's one of the really amazing opportunities of public art in public parks. I'll go back to that for a sec. So the High Line opened in stages. The Section 1 opened in 2009, Section 2 opened in 2011, and the northernmost section, the High Line at the rail yards, opened in 2014. There's one section left of the High Line that is still not open to the public, but will be soon. Construction is starting soon. And that's the SPUR at 10th Avenue, which is circled here. This is the former access point for trains full of mail to get to the Morgan General Mail Facility, which you can see right here. This is an old photograph. It now has a green roof, which is kind of cool, but that's a different conversation. And it's the widest open section of the High Line. And it's one of the pieces that was the most threatened when the entire structure was saved. It was still threatened. But now it's saved, and construction starts soon. And we wanted to take the opportunity with this spur, with this last piece, to do something that really built on what the High Line is good at, and also created opportunities for things where we have some room to grow. And so with that in mind, we created, by the same design team that designed the rest of the park, James Corner Field Operations, Diller Scofidio Renfro, and Pete Udolph as the planting designer. But it takes into account a lot of new factors. So there are more spaces for people to sort of gather off of the main pathway. There are benches that provide really incredible views. There's a lot more flexible space that can be used by people to do whatever they want, or by us to create programming, to create public art and things like that. There's also this very, you can see the green section here is very immersive planting, and that'll completely cover over you. We call it the threshold. That'll be really exciting and immersive and beautiful, particularly in that really busy area right near Hudson Yards. And then moving out onto the open space, which is what we're calling the piazza, is really an open, flexible space. It'll be a wonderful place to gather, and it'll be a wonderful place for public programming, as I mentioned, which is so key to who we are now as an organization, for public art and for things like that. So with that in mind, I will turn to lessons learned. And I think, one of the things about the High Line is it wasn't the first project to do what it did, but it's been one of the most successful and the most looked to models for how you can reuse disused infrastructure and how you can create public benefit like that. And so a lot of people talk to us and they want advice about, I have this rail spur in my city, I have this warehouse, I have this waterfront that used to be industrial, what can I do with it? And we try to help them. We've had hundreds and hundreds of conversations over the past few years with hundreds and hundreds of projects that are trying to do that work. And there are two main lessons learned from the High Line experience that we try to pass on. The first is value capture, and the second is equitable development. And they sort of seem like they might be in tension with each other a little bit, which I'll get to in just a sec. But they actually complement each other, and both of them leverage the potential economic success of a project like the High Line into creating something that is sustainable and something that can be more equitable. So this is a slide that's from our original presentation that we showed to supporters and city agencies back in 2002, when we were really, really, really hoping that someone would care about the High Line, long time ago. And that was saying that if the city invested $100 million in constructing the High Line, over the course of 20 years, they would get $262 million in incremental tax revenue from new development in the neighborhood. And those numbers seemed, we were like, oh, I don't know. Are they going to hold us to that? When we were developing the High Line. And it turns out that we were wrong on both numbers, which it's interesting, right? It actually costs about $190 million to build the High Line. And the 20-year incremental tax revenue to the city is about $1 billion. And that includes the real estate taxes on new development. It also includes tourist spending. And that's a big number, and that money goes into the city's coffers, which is, as a civic-minded New Yorker myself, I'm really glad of. But none of it actually comes back to the High Line. And we didn't know at the time how successful it would be. If we had known, then I think we would have pushed for some way of some portion of that $1 billion to come back to help us operate the park. Instead of 98% and 2%, if it could be 50-50, as a fundraiser, that sounds kind of nice to me. I don't know about all of you. And the other side of that is that the High Line has spurred a lot of new development. And there are definitely real tensions in West Chelsea around gentrification and displacement and things like that. Because most of West Chelsea was zoned industrial, there is less displacement than there could have been had this happened in a much more residential neighborhood, but it's still there and it's still real and it's very palpable for people who live in the neighborhood. And had we known then what we know now, we would have pushed really hard for a lot more affordable housing to have been included in the rezoning that created saved the High Line, and we would have pushed for some of that billion to go back into the neighborhood and into equitable projects within the neighborhood. It's a little late for that now because of how real estate values have exploded in West Chelsea, and that's where we're doing things more on the ground, the public programming to make it better. And then, so yeah, value capture, two different models for that, and I know I'm running out of time, so I'll be quick. Capturing funding from economic impact for maintenance funding for the park itself through the zoning would have been great. we tell people to try and do that when they're building new Highline-like projects. Some kind of business improvement district, neighborhood improvement district, park improvement district, a PID, which doesn't have quite the ring to it, would have been a great model, and we encourage people to do that. And then also focusing on affordable housing, focusing on workforce development, and focusing on small business development within the context of creating Highline-like parks. And then very, very quickly, as I said, there are hundreds of projects around the country, around the world, that are trying to replicate some of the Highline success. And right now, we're in the process of building a new network of those projects and helping them get off the ground and helping them focus not just on their economic impact, but also on their social and environmental impacts. And there's one project in particular at the very top here, the 11th Street Bridge, which is in Washington, D.C., and they have done an amazing job of focusing on social impact with planning their project. It's a former highway bridge over the Anacostia River, and on one side is a wealthy-ish neighborhood in D.C., and on the other is a low-income neighborhood in Anacostia, Maryland. And they have raised $30 million to create a land trust in Anacostia that will preserve community ownership of land and housing. And they've done a lot of other neighborhood community development initiatives that are entirely separate from the money that they've been raising to build the park itself. And that model, I think, is a way that you can work on that tension between economic development and social impact and equitable development. So thank you all very much for having me, and please come to the Highline.